Elliot tugged at his mother's hand as they walked through the sliding doors of Brightmart, the small grocery store in their neighborhood. At just 10 years old, Elliot had an unusually keen sense of responsibility, which had only grown in recent months as he watched his mom juggle long hours at the diner and late nights at home, trying to stretch every dollar. The pandemic had left its mark on their lives, and while Sarah did everything she could to make sure Elliot never felt the full weight of their struggles, he wasn't blind to the stress she carried. Despite their challenges, Elliot never complained. Instead, he looked for ways to help. He had started walking dogs, raking leaves, and running errands for neighbors, earning a modest allowance that he carefully tucked away in a little tin box under his bed. For weeks, he had been saving for a shiny red toy car he'd seen in the grocery store, a reward he felt he'd earned after so many hours of work. "Are you excited about getting your car today?" Sarah asked as they entered the store, her voice light despite the exhaustion she masked with a faint smile. Elliot nodded eagerly. "Yeah, I can't wait to try it out. It's the kind that zooms really far if you pull it back first." Sarah chuckled as she reached for a shopping cart. "Well, you've worked hard for it, sweetheart. You deserve it." Elliot's heart swelled at her words, and he followed her into the aisles, his pocket bulging slightly from the small envelope where he had stashed his savings $12 he had earned over the past 3 weeks. Sarah moved through the aisles with precision, carefully scanning the prices of the items she picked up. Rice, beans, bread, and milk quickly filled the cart, essentials and nothing more. Elliot noticed the way she hesitated before reaching for a carton of eggs, as though weighing the cost in her mind. She finally placed it in the cart with a soft sigh, and Elliot felt a pang in his chest. He wanted to tell her not to worry, but he also knew she would brush it off, assuring him that everything was fine. As they neared the checkout area, Elliot spotted the display of toy cars he had been dreaming about. His eyes lit up, and he rushed over, carefully choosing the red one he'd admired so many times before. Holding it up triumphantly, he ran back to his mom, who was placing their groceries on the conveyor belt. "Look," he said, his grin wide. "This is the one I wanted." Sarah's face softened, and she reached out to smooth his hair. "You worked hard for that," she said. "I'm proud of you." Elliot beamed, clutching the card to his chest as the cashier began scanning their items. Nearby, another line caught his attention. A man stood at the register, his shoulders slumped as he rummaged through his pockets. His clothes were neat but slightly worn, and there was an air of weariness about him, as though life had been throwing him one curveball after another. "I'm sorry, sir," the cashier in his line said gently. "Your card's declined again." The man's face turned red as he pulled out a crumpled bill and a handful of coins, counting them twice before letting out a defeated sigh. "I guess I'll have to put some of it back," he murmured, his voice barely audible. Elliot froze, his grip on the toy car loosening. He watched as the man picked up a few items, a loaf of bread, a carton of milk, and a bag of apples, and set them aside, muttering an apology to the cashier. The sight made Elliot's chest ache. He looked down at the toy car in his hands, then at the envelope in his pocket. A small voice in his mind whispered that he'd been saving for weeks, that he deserved this toy. But another voice, louder and clearer, reminded him of his mom's words, of how proud she was of him for working hard. And suddenly the idea of keeping the money for himself felt small and selfish. "Mom," he whispered, tugging at Sarah's sleeve, "I want to help him." Sarah turned to him, startled. "Elliot, that's your money. You've been saving for weeks." "I know," he said firmly, his voice steady. "But he needs it more." Before Sarah could respond, Elliot took a deep breath, stepped out of line, and approached the man. The stranger looked up in surprise as Elliot tapped his elbow. "Excuse me," Elliot said shyly, holding out the envelope. "You can use this." The man blinked, his face a mix of astonishment and disbelief. What, he stammered. "No, I can't." "Please," Elliot insisted, his cheeks flushing. "It's okay. I want to help." For a moment the man said nothing. Then, slowly he reached for the envelope, his hand trembling. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You don't know what this means to me." Elliot offered a small smile, his heart swelling with an unfamiliar but wonderful feeling. As the man completed his purchase, Sarah knelt beside Elliot and pulled him into a warm hug. "That was a beautiful thing you just did," she said, her voice catching. Elliot watched as the man left the store, his groceries in hand and his head held a little higher. A sense of pride filled Elliot, though it was tinged with a hint of sadness. The shiny red car remained on the shelf, and he didn't know when he'd be able to save up for it again. But as they walked home, groceries in hand, Elliot couldn't help but feel that he had gained something far more valuable. What he didn't know was that his simple act of kindness was about to change their lives in ways he could never have imagined. The following days passed in a blur of routine for Sarah and Elliot. Sarah worked long hours at the diner, while Elliot focused on his schoolwork and continued helping around the neighborhood. Despite their modest life, Sarah always made sure their home felt warm and loving, filling it with little moments of joy and laughter. Elliot was a bright spot in every day, his optimism contagious, even when times were tough. One afternoon, Sarah's boss at the diner asked her to cover an extra shift. The breakfast rush was always hectic, but she couldn't afford to say no. "Elliot, you're coming with me today," she told him as they headed out the door. "I'll set you up in the corner booth with your crayons." "Sound good?" Elliot nodded eagerly. He loved visiting the diner, where he could sit and watch the steady hum of people coming and going. With his paper and crayons, he'd spend hours sketching everything from superheroes to toy cars, his imagination running wild. That morning, the diner was busier than usual. Sarah darted between tables, taking orders and refilling coffee cups with practiced efficiency. Elliot sat in his favorite booth near the window, sketching a car chase scene while occasionally glancing up to wave at his mom. It was in the middle of this chaos that the door jingled, and a familiar face walked in. It was the man from the grocery store. He wore the same neat but slightly worn clothes, and his eyes carried the same weary kindness that Elliot remembered. He paused at the door, scanning the room, until his gaze landed on Sarah. Recognition flickered in his expression, and he walked over to an empty booth near the window. When Sarah approached to take his order, the man hesitated before speaking. "It's you," he said, his voice tinged with surprise. "From the grocery store." Sarah blinked, caught off guard. "Yes," she said, her brow furrowing slightly. "I remember you." The man offered a small, warm smile. "I'm Andrew," he said. "Your son helped me that day. I've been thinking about it ever since." Sarah softened at the mention of Elliot. "That sounds like him," she said, glancing over at her son, who was still engrossed in his drawing. "He's got a big heart." Andrew nodded, his gaze drifting to Elliot. "It was more than that," he said. "He didn't even hesitate. He saw someone in need and he acted. I don't think I've ever experienced anything like that." Sarah didn't know how to respond. Andrew's sincerity was palpable, and she could see the genuine gratitude in his eyes. "He's a special kid," she said softly. "But honestly, I'm just trying to raise him to see the good in people." Andrew seemed to reflect on her words for a moment before he spoke again. "I'd like to thank you both properly. Would you and Elliot join me for lunch tomorrow?" "My treat." Sarah hesitated, unsure of how to respond. She wasn't used to gestures like this, and she didn't want to impose, but something about Andrew's earnestness made her trust him. "All right," she said finally, "we'd be happy to." As Andrew left the diner, Sarah walked over to Elliot and told him about the lunch invitation. "Do you remember the man from the grocery store?" she asked. Elliot's eyes lit up. "Yeah, is he okay?" "He's more than okay," Sarah said, smiling. "He wants to have lunch with us tomorrow to thank you." Elliot's face broke into a grin. "That sounds awesome." As they left the diner that afternoon, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that their encounter with Andrew wasn't just a chance meeting. Something about it felt like the start of something much bigger. though she couldn't yet put her finger on what. Is that the ending? If not, continue with part 4. Continue naturally, don't repeat anything from the previous part. Don't mention any subtitles. The next day, Sarah and Elliot arrived at the restaurant where Andrew had invited them for lunch. It was a cozy, family-owned place with sunlight streaming through the windows and a friendly, inviting atmosphere. Elliot's eyes widened as he took in the neat tablecloths, fresh flowers, and polished silverware. "Mom, this place is so nice," he whispered. Sarah smiled, smoothing her dress. It wasn't new, but she had taken extra care to press it and look her best. "It is," she said softly. "Let's remember to thank Andrew for inviting us." Andrew was already seated at a corner table, and as they approached, he stood and smiled warmly. "Sarah, Elliot, it's so good to see you," he said, shaking Sarah's hand and crouching slightly to greet Elliot. "How are you today, young man?" Elliot grinned shyly. "I'm good," he said, his voice quiet but excited. As they took their seats, Andrew waved for a server and ordered drinks for the table, making sure Elliot got something special, a tall glass of chocolate milk topped with whipped cream and a cherry. Elliot's face lit up when the drink arrived. "This is amazing," he exclaimed, holding the glass carefully with both hands. During the meal, Andrew engaged Elliot in conversation, asking about his favorite toys, hobbies, and what he wanted to be when he grew up. The boy's initial shyness quickly faded, and he began to talk animatedly about his drawings, toy cars, and dreams of becoming an engineer. Andrew listened attentively, smiling and nodding as Elliot shared his thoughts. Sarah watched the exchange with quiet pride, but she couldn't shake the question that had lingered since the grocery store. Finally, as they finished their main courses, she leaned forward slightly. "Andrew," she said gently, "I hope you don't mind me asking, but why didn't you have enough to pay for your groceries that day? You don't seem like the kind of person who's struggling." Andrew chuckled, his expression turning sheepish. "That's a fair question," he said. "The truth is, I'd just paid off a large bill earlier that morning, something I'd been planning to handle for weeks. It slipped my mind completely, and when I got to the store, I only had a few dollars in cash left on me. I thought I'd have enough in my account for what I needed, but I miscalculated." He shrugged lightly. It was one of those embarrassing moments you don't expect, but Elliot stepped in before I could even process what to do. He didn't just help me pay for groceries, he turned what could have been a bad day into something I'll never forget. Sarah felt her heart warm at his words, and she glanced at Elliot, who was fidgeting with his silverware, listening intently. "That does sound like him," she said with a soft smile. "He has a way of seeing when someone needs help." Andrew nodded, his gaze filled with gratitude. It wasn't just that he helped, it was how he did it. No hesitation, no second thoughts. That kind of generosity is rare, especially in someone so young. He reached under the table and pulled out a small gift bag. "Elliot," he said, sliding the bag toward him, "there's something I noticed about you that day. You were looking at this, weren't you?" Elliot's eyes widened as he opened the bag and pulled out the shiny red car he had dreamed of. His jaw dropped and he held it up, admiring every detail. "The car," he exclaimed. "The one I wanted." Andrew grinned. "That's right. I couldn't leave the store without making sure you got it." "Thank you so much," Elliot said, his face lighting up with joy. "This is the best gift ever." Sarah blinked back tears as she watched her son's happiness. "Andrew, that's incredibly thoughtful," she said, her voice trembling. "Thank you." Andrew waved off her thanks with a smile. "It's the least I could do after what he did for me. But there's something else I want to do." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a white envelope, placing it gently on the table and sliding it toward Sarah. "Inside is a check for $10,000, he said. "I'd like to put it toward Elliot's future, his college fund, or whatever dreams he decides to pursue." Sarah gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Andrew, this is so generous," she stammered. "I don't know how to thank you." You don't need to thank me, Andrew said, his tone steady. Your son reminded me of the power of kindness. He gave me something I hadn't realized I was missing, a reminder that people still care. I want to make sure he knows how much that meant. Elliot looked up at his mom, his voice full of wonder. Does this mean I can go to college, Mom? Tears rolled down Sarah's cheeks as she hugged him tightly. Yes, sweetheart, she whispered. This means you can go to college. Andrew smiled as he watched them, his heart full. What had started as an embarrassing moment in the grocery store had turned into something far more meaningful, a chance to give back and to witness the incredible impact of one small act of kindness. In the days that followed, Sarah couldn't stop thinking about Andrew's generosity. She carried the envelope with the check in her purse, occasionally opening it just to reassure herself that it was real. The number on the check felt surreal, like something out of a dream, and the possibilities it opened up for Elliot's future left her heart both hopeful and overwhelmed. Elliot, meanwhile, was filled with excitement. Every night before bed, he would take the red car Andrew had given him and zoom it across the kitchen table, imagining the day he could design something even more incredible. Mom, he asked one evening as he played, do you think I'll be able to build real cars one day? Sarah smiled as she washed the dishes. I think you can do anything you set your mind to, sweetheart. And now, thanks to Andrew, you'll have the chance to learn how. That Sunday morning, Sarah decided it was time to do something meaningful with Andrew's gift. She and Elliot visited the local bank to open a savings account in Elliot's name. The financial advisor, a kind woman with glasses perched on her nose, helped them through the process. When the check was deposited and the account was set up, Sarah let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. This means a lot, doesn't it, Mom? Elliot asked as they left the bank. Sarah knelt down to his level, cupping his face in her hands. It means everything, she said. This is the start of your future, Elliot. The one you deserve. Elliot beamed, clutching the little receipt the bank teller had given him, as if it were proof that dreams really could come true. The following week, Sarah found herself thinking about how Andrew's generosity had rippled through their lives. It wasn't just the money, it was the way he had recognized Elliot's kindness and wanted to honor it. Inspired, she decided to do something small to pass that kindness on. After her shift at the diner one evening, Sarah stopped by the grocery store and picked up a bag of fresh produce, some bread, and a few pantry staples. She and Elliot carried the bag down the hall of their apartment building and knocked on Mrs. Jenkins's door. Mrs. Jenkins was an elderly woman who had lived alone since her husband passed. She opened the door slowly, her face lighting up when she saw Sarah and Elliot standing there. Why, hello, you two, she said warmly. What brings you by? We thought you might need a little help, Sarah said, handing her the bag of groceries. Oh my goodness, Mrs. Jenkins said, her voice trembling with gratitude. You didn't have to do this. Thank you, dear. Both of you. Elliot stepped forward with a grin. My mom says small things can make a big difference, he said. Mrs. Jenkins nodded, her eyes misty. She's right, she said softly. She raised a good boy. As they walked back to their apartment, Sarah looked down at Elliot. You know, Andrew's kindness wasn't just for us, she said. It's a reminder to keep spreading it wherever we can. Elliot nodded solemnly. Like a ripple in a pond, he said. Sarah smiled, her chest swelling with pride. Exactly. That night, after Elliot had gone to bed, Sarah sat by the window, looking out at the city lights. She thought about all the ways life could unfold now, all the opportunities that lay ahead for her son. And though their challenges hadn't vanished, they felt more manageable. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to dream, to believe that better days weren't just possible, but within reach. Life continued to unfold with its usual rhythm for Sarah and Elliot. But the undercurrent of hope that Andrew's kindness had sparked remained strong. The check in Elliot's name wasn't just money, it was a promise. A symbol of possibility that brightened even the hardest days. Elliot threw himself into his schoolwork with renewed energy, inspired by the idea that he could truly achieve his dreams. At the same time, Sarah began to notice subtle shifts in how they approached life. Where once she might have felt weighed down by worry, she now found herself making real plans for a future she could now imagine clearly. One day, a letter arrived in their mailbox. It was addressed to both Sarah and Elliot, and as Sarah opened it, she recognized Andrew's neat handwriting. Inside was a short, heartfelt note. Dear Sarah and Elliot, I hope this note finds you well. I've been thinking a lot about our time together, and how much your family has already inspired me. It's not just Elliot's kindness, it's the way you both live your lives, with so much warmth and hope, even when things aren't easy. I wanted you to know that I've decided to start something meaningful, a foundation dedicated to acts of kindness like the one Elliot showed me. It will provide scholarships and support to kids with big dreams, kids who remind me of Elliot. I hope we can work together to make a difference. Warm regards, Andrew. Sarah read the letter twice, her hands trembling. Then she passed it to Elliot, who sat at the kitchen table with wide eyes as he absorbed the words. Mom, he said softly, we helped him start something amazing. Tears filled Sarah's eyes as she pulled him into a hug. Yes, sweetheart, she whispered. You really did. In the weeks that followed, Andrew's foundation began to take shape, and he stayed in touch with Sarah and Elliot as he worked on its mission. True to his word, he named the initiative after Elliot's act of generosity, ensuring that his story would inspire others to give without hesitation. Years later, when the time came for Elliot to pack his bags for college, Sarah stood in the doorway of their little apartment, watching him load his things into the car. The shiny red toy car sat on his desk, a reminder of the day everything had changed. As Elliot turned back to her, his face glowing with excitement, she pulled him into a tight hug. You're going to do amazing things, she said, her voice thick with emotion. Elliot smiled, his eyes shining. Thanks to you, Mom. And Andrew. He paused, looking thoughtful. And I'll remember to keep the ripple going. Sarah laughed softly, wiping a tear from her cheek. I know you will. As the car pulled away, Sarah stood in the doorway, watching until it disappeared around the corner. She felt a bittersweet mix of pride and longing. But above all, she felt grateful for Andrew, for Elliot, and for the unshakable belief that kindness could change the world, one act at a time.